The Victorian era, known for its prosperity, also harbored a stark reality: the doss houses. These were cheap lodging houses in dark alleys and basements, providing a last refuge for society's marginalized amidst hunger, disease, and despair. Here, those marginalized by society would clutch their meager coins and huddle together. For them, the doss house was the last bastion essential for survival. Amidst hunger, cold, disease, and despair, people struggled to endure and survive in these unsanitary, foul-smelling places, filled with the fear of starvation, cold, and contagious diseases. It was truly a house of despair. What kind of places were these doss houses, and why did they emerge during this era? There was an unimaginable dark world spread out within. Let's take a closer look at the conditions of the doss houses. During the illustrious and glorious Victorian era, Britain thrived as a modern state. Behind this prosperity, however, many of the poor were subjected to harsh living conditions. They sought refuge in cheap lodging houses known as doss houses. But why did such facilities come into existence? The background to the birth of doss houses is deeply connected to the social issues that Britain faced at that time. Let's first examine the historical context in which doss houses were born. Doss houses emerged during the Victorian era, from 1837 to 1901. During these approximately 60 years, Britain dominated the world. Politically, the Conservative and Liberal parties alternated in power under a two-party system. Culturally, new ideologies like liberalism and socialism were budding, and feminist movements were also gaining momentum. Technological innovations, such as railroads and steam engines, were advancing, making Britain a leading global power, deserving of the title, the British Empire. This period was known as the Pax Britannica. Britain was indeed at the center of the world. During this era, Britain, with its overwhelming national power, acquired numerous colonies. The remarkable technological innovations of the Industrial Revolution further developed its industry and economy to the extent that it was called the workshop of the world. However, alongside this brilliant development, a significant problem emerged in British urban areas. It was the deplorable living conditions of workers and the widening gap between the rich and the poor. The rapid influx of a large number of people into urban areas led to a sudden population increase. This rapid change resulted in a shortage of housing, causing a surge in homelessness. The homeless had no choice but to sleep on the streets. The poor sanitation and lack of nutrition led to a constant stream of people falling ill, forcing urban dwellers to take measures. However, building comfortable homes for all the people flooding into the cities required time, money, and space, all of which were in short supply. As a result, housing that could accommodate as many people as possible at once was built. Under these circumstances, low-cost lodging facilities known as doss houses were created to house the lower classes who had no homes and nowhere to go. Despite the harsh environment, many workers and the poor flocked to doss houses because it was better than sleeping on the streets. Because of the miserable living conditions, these places were also called flophouses. They were essentially the last resort for society's outcasts. It is said that nearly 40,000 people lived in these doss houses in London alone at the time. Doss houses can be seen as another face of the Victorian era, hidden in the shadows of its prosperity. The birth of doss houses, brought about in exchange for the Victorian era's prosperity, was due to the rapid population increase that outstripped the supply of housing. The conditions in these places were unimaginably harsh by modern standards, hardly worthy of being called homes. What kind of scenes were there? Let's delve into the records of the time to uncover the reality. Doss houses were always located in basements that never saw daylight. Descending the dim stairs from the street outside, one would be greeted by a gloomy and eerie atmosphere. Stepping into the room, there was only a single small lamp. The feeble light revealed rows of beds, which were merely mattresses laid on the floor, hardly deserving to be called beds. Some rooms didn't even have beds, just wooden benches. The only thing provided to those staying there was a place to lie down and rest. Privacy was almost non-existent, and in the worst cases, people were forced to sleep sitting up. In the morning, they were immediately driven out of their beds. This was the general reality of a doss house. Such harsh environments earned doss houses the nickname, poor man's hotels. It's needless to say that this living condition was far removed from the image of hotel living that we have today. But this is just the beginning. The most notorious DOS houses were so horrendous that recalling them is enough to make one shudder. The worst DOS houses were concentrated in the slums of Spitalfields in the East End. The people who gathered at the DOS houses in this area were beggars, prostitutes, shady peddlers, and other poor individuals living on the edge of crime. For those forced into a day-to-day existence and for those involved in criminal activities, finding a safe place to stay was not easy. Under such circumstances, they ended up in the DOS houses in these slums. In other words, they had no choice but to use the facilities in this area. The only place they could afford to stay was the lowest level of DOS houses in this area, and there were no other places for them to sleep. Now, let's introduce the rooms of the DOS houses in this area. An English journalist of that time, Henry Mayhew, described the inside of a DOS house as nearly 20 people crammed into a small room. The heat and stench were unbearable. The room was about 23 feet by 18 feet, and over 20 people were packed into it. There was almost no lighting, and no proper sanitation or water. Naturally, pests and diseases were rampant, making it a filthy and foul-smelling hellish space. The DOS houses clustered in this area were so horrific that they were called houses of despair. And they represented a world concentrated with the dark side of society. Inside the DOS houses, there was unimaginable overcrowding and filth, serving as a gathering place for people at the very bottom of society. However, for those without money, it was still a better option than sleeping on the streets. That said, there were actually various types of DOS houses, each with its own level of misery. Let's take a look into the diverse world of DOS houses. First, we have the four-penny coffin, a DOS house where one could sleep in a coffin-shaped box. For the low price of 4 pennies, one could stay from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., with water and food included. When the homeless used these facilities, they were given a cover called a tarp to sleep in so they wouldn't dirty the bed. It's a grim image of poor people lying on their backs in coffin-like boxes, but this was the norm for the lowest class at that time. Incredibly, this functional coffin hotel was praised as a compassionate effort for the homeless. It's like a scene from a black comedy. Astonishingly, there were even cheaper accommodations than the 4-penny coffin. For instance, the penny sit-up, which cost only a penny. As the name suggests, guests would sit up to sleep. They would sit on a chair and lean against a rope to sleep. But this was just the beginning. There was also the 2-penny hangover, where people slept standing up, leaning against a rope. Sleeping while hanging onto a rope is unimaginable today, but the poor had no other choice. To escape hunger and cold, they had to use these harsh accommodations. Some DOS houses even had bed-sharing systems. There was a 2-person relay system, where one person used the bed during the day and another at night, and a 3-person relay system, where 3 people shared a bed in 8-hour shifts. These conditions completely ignored privacy and hygiene, creating an unimaginable environment. Thus, there were various types of DOS houses with different fees and usage methods, but they all had terrible conditions by modern standards. You might wonder if there weren't any better facilities. Of course, there were some shelters for the poor in the Victorian era besides DOS houses. For example, there were free accommodations set up in charitable shelters called casual wards, which functioned as labor shelters for people who had become homeless. These were better equipped than DOS houses. But they were still labor shelters, where harsh labor and participation in religious activities were often mandatory. If one disliked such an environment, the only alternative was a DOS house. These drifters were called transients, temporary lodgers struggling to survive day by day. So, how many people lived in DOS houses at that time? According to a survey in 1839, there were about 220 lodging houses in London, with a total population of around 2,500 people. However, events like the Irish famine starting in 1847 caused a significant influx of refugees, greatly increasing this number. By 1854, the number of registered communal dormitories in the capital had reached 1,441, providing about 30,000 accommodations. Many lodging facilities were built to cope with the rapidly growing population, leading to the creation of the horrific spaces we've discussed. So, what happened to the doss houses after they were created during the Victorian era? Naturally, doss houses no longer exist in modern Britain. Several reasons prevented them from lasting long. Let's look back at the circumstances when doss houses were built. The Industrial Revolution caused towns to overflow with people, leading to a housing shortage. Thus, the priority was to build housing that could accommodate many people, ignoring comfort. This led to the creation of doss houses. Many doss houses were never meant for long-term use. They had no proper foundations and walls were only half as thick, making collapses common. The shoddy construction of doss houses was influenced by the laws of the time as well. At that time, landlords in the slums were limited to leasing land for a maximum of 21 years. Consequently, there was no incentive for landlords to construct sturdy doss houses, so they built them quickly and cheaply to make money. These circumstances led to the construction of many low-durability doss houses during the Victorian era in England. Because of the need to build quickly and inexpensively, their numbers rapidly increased, and by the late 1800s, doss houses had become a common temporary lodging for the common people of London. By the end of the 1900s, there were about 1,000 doss houses in London. However, by that time, most of the doss houses from the Victorian era had become uninhabitable due to significant deterioration. As a result, they were demolished by the 1960s. In this way, the doss houses disappeared in a sort of self-destruction due to their unsustainable design. However, the disappearance of doss houses can also be attributed to a change in societal views towards them. From around the 1870s, voices began to criticize the deplorable living conditions in doss houses, even for the poor. While it might seem heartening that many people cared, the catalyst for this criticism was somewhat unexpected. It was one of the pernicious practices known as slum tours. At that time, some wealthy individuals would infiltrate slums for entertainment and stay in doss houses. This form of poverty tourism was undoubtedly insensitive and tasteless. However, it exposed many middle and upper-class people to the harsh realities of life in the slums. Ironically, this led to increased interest in social reform movements and the push for better living conditions for the poor. Thus, doss houses continued to exist until the 1960s, serving as shelters for many impoverished people, while also being seen as a source of amusement by some. This duality makes doss houses a reflection of both the light and shadow of the Victorian era. Learning about the history of doss houses, which were essential for the poor despite their terrible conditions, may provide us with important insights as we reflect on modern prosperity and equality. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more insightful content. Take care and see you in the next video. Goodbye.